Welcome to the show. My guest today is Jason Corey, the Senior Director for Emerging Technologies at Red Hat. Jason, welcome to the program.
Jason, good to see you.
Let me set a little bit of context for our discussion today. It's been almost 4 years since the Office of Management and Budget launched their code.gov platform, where agencies can post open source and promote reuse. While this definitely wasn't the beginning of the use of open source across government, a recent survey shows that interest in using secure, community-based code obviously is growing. The survey respondents from the 25 largest agencies found, generally speaking, open source provided a way to build community around the software, to create development efficiencies, to demonstrate competencies, and to view code as being beneficial to the public. Now, at the same time, respondents also continue to have concerns about open source. These included areas around scope alignment, changes in work practices, risk avoidance, specifically cybersecurity risk, and the need for permissions to use the code themselves. Now, despite these continued what we'll call culture hesitations about open source, there are plenty of examples from NASA to the Smithsonian Institution to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to the Defense Department who are finding value from using open source software. And now with the surge and the acceleration of the move to the cloud, open source can play actually a bigger role for all agencies. And that's where our guest comes in, and he's going to tell us how that works. Once again, my guest is Jason Corey, the Senior Director for Emerging Technologies at Red Hat. Now, Jason, let me just start at the surge for telework, the surge for cloud services. It all comes back to the coronavirus pandemic and how agencies have been able to react, transform, and continue to meet mission. Just initially, what are you seeing from your customers? How has the digital transformation, IT modernization, whatever we're going to call this, really been impacted by the pandemic?
Yeah, no, appreciate it again. I hope everybody's safe these crazy times. So I think, the observations we're seeing across both the federal and state and local markets are really around acceleration of projects that really clients wanted to begin prior to the pandemic, that because now of things like telework and the need to do things like auto scale are really just being accelerated. So I think, the obvious ones that have been across the news are just things like cloud technologies and some of the scalability and both flexibility of those offerings. And I think the other thing we're seeing a lot of is automation, right? I think people recognize now that the more you can automate technologies to do things on their own, the quicker you can adapt. And in these times, adaptation is really the key. So I think there's been projects that have been held up that now are moving much faster. And I think there's even some of the cultural points you mentioned during the open. I think those are being broken down too, right? Is things like security and what are things just like telemedicine and telework present in that construct are really being kind of viewed a little differently because the risk reward ratios is shifted.
You bring up an interesting point about the risk reward ratio, and I think that's really important. I think one of the things the pandemic has done, specifically initially and then into the next few months as people adapted, is okay, what's the reward? How can we make sure we get to applications, make sure we get the data we need, make sure that we are doing the things we need to do to meet mission versus, well, if we take that off-prem, or if we don't move that to the cloud, that could hurt us in some way, and the security risk is too high. Do you think that's been among the biggest changes? Is that re-looking at the risk-reward ratio?
Yeah, absolutely. I think when you really think about the decisions that all of our government clients have to make, there's always really strong intentions, right? They want to do the best things for citizens, for the mission, but they have challenges. Budgets are a big piece of that, and the risk reward ratio when it comes to that really is a focal piece, right? So I think what we've seen is that whether it's in the DoD space or in the civilian market or in state and local, people recognize that we have to forward invest in some of these capabilities because who knows what tomorrow is going to hold. And I do think sometimes when you look at that risk reward ratio and even something as simple as moving to the cloud, it's costly, it's disruptive. There's a lot of change on the process side that has to happen. But again, the benefits you get of doing that are, your unemployment website will auto scale, right? When you go from 6,000 requests to 313,000 requests a day, which is some of the things we're seeing in some of our customer bases. So, I think it's a positive, but at the same time, we're also really cognizant of, there's risk that it gets introduced when you try and go faster, and that's really the role Red Hat's tried to play within that ecosystem, balancing the two.
Let's talk a little bit about that balance, because I think one thing that as agencies move to modernize their applications, move to the cloud, that risk reward and the balance of it is really key. And I think, as you talked about, something that Red Hat tries to do, open source can play a big role in that risk reward balance. Talk maybe a little bit about how you're seeing customers and or people in the public sector starting to use open source to balance that risk reward ratio.
Yeah, I mean, so when we talk about open source, I like to frame it in three different ways, because open source is kind of like the term cloud, right? It's very, very broad. So I think about it as both, the natural thing people think about is the development model, right? So the way software is created via an open source development model. And then the output of that is oftentimes, right, technology that's used across the enterprise now. So, it's the development model, it's a type of technology. And then increasingly over the last 6 to 7 years, we've seen a shift in customers of really, it's also a way to organize, and it's a leadership construct, right, for this new kind of information age where adaptability is important, and voicing of ideas and being transparent becomes more and more important. So I think with each of those, Red Hat has tried to play a role, right? So obviously on the open source development model, we're a 27-year-old company now that really helped to found the concept around open source. I mean, most people still associate Red Hat with Red Hat Enterprise Linux, but as technologies across cloud, virtualization, AI have sprung up, the majority of those innovations are coming from open source development, open source communities. And that's had a natural shift for really kind of what the vendor community looks like right now, right? Like, in 1993, we were one of the only open source enterprise software companies, but now every major vendor that government clients will work with have an open source practice or an open source capability. So I think, that technology has really, really kind of come a long way. And then on the organizational side of it, that is an area where, we believe open source applies to areas outside of technology, whether it's medicine or education. So our CEO has written books around how to organize around the concepts for open. And I think when you go back to really understand trends around agile development, and they're very similar, right? So I think what's happening over the last 5 or 6 years is that concepts that have been in open source development communities for a long time are now being applied to the marketing department and the operations team and how we do logistics, right, in different ways. So, and I think in all three of those, the development model, the technology, and the broader discussion around organizational models, we've played a really active role.
I love the analogy you made around Agile and DevSecOps and things like that, where a lot of the practices in open source now are being just moved into these other areas. And I think that's why maybe the risk reward ratio is starting to change, because I think agencies are more comfortable understanding, well, we had success with Agile. We brought people in, we brought in the user, we've talked about user journeys. And in many ways, that's what open source, when the development side, the tech side was all about, was get more brains in the room to help solve the problem. Do you think that's why, in some ways, and again, I use this quite often, the silver lining in this pandemic is this acceleration of digital transformation, that they're able to do it fast because there was an urgency, but also there's this comfortability that has developed because of these other concepts like you described?
Yeah, no, I think that's 100% true. And I think, you can see it on even things like Super Bowl commercials, right? Where like developers are prominently kind of showcased. But I think, and I had a conversation with my son this morning, who's 12, and he was asking me questions about technology. And I was explaining to him, with the DoD, we work on a lot of mission systems and weapon systems. And he's like, well, why does Red Hat talk to people that build missiles or tanks or any of these things? Like and I said, well, because all of those are software, right? Like, yes, there's, a certain level of hardware and weaponry and so forth. But everything that we touch now is software. And that really has, I think, really start to be understood, but that's what's driven sort of the rise of like how Agile can be applied to these. And because such great software has been developed via these same methodologies, now people are really opening up the aperture of how could it be applied to other areas of the organization, to really drive in that adaptability. And I think that's a really important term, right? Is how can you be more adaptive and be faster? So most of what we see around our technology, like we deliver platforms predominantly, right? And then we help customers build capabilities on top of those. But a lot of them are about increasing data-driven decisions, right? Or increasing like speed to capability with, fielding of a certain capability, both in the civilian or the DoD markets, or state and local. So I think you got to kind of peel it back to figure out like, well, yes, you need these platforms. And I like to describe them as like platforms for progress, right? Like the platforms by themselves don't do anything. It's about, how do they help you make progress in a specific, mission area that you really, are trying to drive that speed.
Let's talk maybe a little bit more about what you're starting to see in the use of open source across government. My introduction, obviously, I highlighted some of the concerns, and specifically the code.gov effort, which is obviously almost 4 years old, launched in November of 2016. But as I mentioned, open source is not new. It's not like all of a sudden someone at OMB, the federal CIO at the time, Tony Scott, said, oh, let's do open source. It's been used by DoD and others for decades. Give me a sense of where we are today. What some of the trends you're seeing around the use of open source software and technology?
Yeah, so I think the simplest way to describe it is like clients now view open source the same way they view COTS. And what I mean by that is they're not as concerned with like questions on security. Like I've been at Red Hat 10 years, and prior to that, I've worked in the DoD for a long time. When I first got to Red Hat, I spent most of my time kind of describing like why we believe open source is more secure, and how it should be viewed on the same playing field as like proprietary COTS solution that they may be looking at. But I think it's shifted more now to, hey, we understand, especially with companies like Red Hat, that these products are very secure and they're very capable. So it becomes more about the features and then the outcomes that they're really trying to get to. So I think on the topic of open source in general, that's where we are, and that's a really, really good place. I think more broadly, now they're trying to determine, whether it's app modernization or, moves to the cloud or different data initiatives, because data really is kind of becoming the next focal point in my mind, and we're doing a lot of work there. But I think now it's about trying to apply these things together, right? So how do you take cloud and, maybe some data technologies and what we're trying to do in an agency, like put them together to really build a capability quickly. So, and then the last thing we are seeing quite a bit of is people work with Red Hat not just for the technology. They're very interested, again, in this sort of business model, this organization model. How do you incentivize people in like a remote environment that maybe don't work for your company, right? All these are like very common things that Red Hat and open source communities have been doing for a long time. So a lot of the meetings I have with executives around the Beltway and a lot of our system integrator partners focus more around like the skills piece and how to organize and how to attract talent, because that's really the secret ingredient these days.
All right, well, there's plenty more to dig out of there. We can even talk more about skill sets and how you organize around using open source principles after the break. First, we're going to take a quick break. You're listening to the discussion Innovation in Government, sponsored by Carahsoft on Federal News Network.